like a bunch of nothing.
In your own like demiurgic prison.
Yeah. No, so I don't know.
Well, welcome to Mystic and the Machine. Today we have a very special guest. We have Keelan or Formscapes from the YouTube channel Formscapes, which has become one of our favorite esoteric channels. Thanks so much for coming. And would you like to introduce yourself to our audience and just sort of let them know what you're about?
Yeah, totally. Well, it's funny that everybody says that my channel is very esoteric, which is really interesting because it really that wasn't exactly my path. Like my thing has always been just like weird science and philosophy stuff that I've just kind of stitched together, and it just kind of like became extremely esoteric over time. Right. And so a lot of my audience, they're people who are really into like the channel Esoterica and a lot of these other channels that are really dedicated to that, which is interesting because it means I've learned a lot of stuff that I didn't know, because the real esoteric stuff is actually kind of new to me. Like recently I've been going through what's it called? John Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica. And so that's actually really the first like for real esoteric text that I've kind of went in on in the same way that I've gone in on a lot of the other like philosophers that I talk about on my channel. So, but anyway, yeah, that's what I do. I make video essays about that kind of thing. And yeah.
Welcome.
Yeah, I think even like the sort of because I agree, it's sort of like not it's not like as much like esoterica, like decrypting John Dee manuscripts and such like that, but it is certainly like those sort of questioning philosophies that don't get a lot of space in public kind of debate about stuff and things. And I think your way that you approach the scientism versus science sort of discussion fairly recently on your channel is really fantastic, and something that I've been sort of exploring over the last year or so as well. It's something I've been thinking about over the last year or so as well, especially. So I really appreciated your angle and the way you approached that topic.
Yeah, that's what we wanted to dive in with you about today, since I saw a little bit of the debate going on between you and some asshole YouTuber.
Oh yeah,
decided to
fun guy, great dude. Everybody loves him. Yeah.
Decided to debunk your your video, and we tried to watch a little bit of it, but he wasn't really engaging with your point at all. He was just sort of, and I'm used to that sort of thing, obviously having occupied the leftist YouTube space. I'm used to that kind of bad faith, especially when you're coming from a more esoteric or philosophical or psychological perspective and you're trying to sort of tackle these elements within the zeitgeist. The debunkers like to come after you. So yeah, let's dive right in. Do you want to ask your first question?
Well, I think like one of the biggest things that sort of stuck out to me through your whole video, sort of exploring this idea, and is a topic that I've been very fascinated in over a few years, and it's something we talk about a lot on this channel, is UFOs and stuff, right? And so I feel like that specific topic gets folks within that sort of like dogmatic belief in the speed of light and like all of this kind of shit that they would just sort of like spiel out to you, even despite all of this numerous data points you've got on all of these sightings and physical evidence and all sorts of things. Yet you would still come back to these like hard, like this is the model and it doesn't fit the model, and so that can't exist, or that doesn't happen, or it must be a balloon, or whatever the fuck.
And that's how you can really tell whether somebody's being dogmatic or not. Like there's always going to be like little things that don't quite fit with your pet theory, but when you're just dismissing troves of evidence to save the theory, like, you know, and that happens in science all the time, not just with physics, but I mean, like with evolutionary biology, this is something I've talked about a lot. And I mean, probably all kinds of things I don't even know about, but it's there because scientific institutions, really institutions in general, are kind of necessarily conservative. And then you start feeding billions of dollars into that. after World War II, when basically government started realizing, oh, we can use science to kill billions of people, like, and then it became this whole kind of self-perpetuating complex where it's interesting because a lot of the people who were really at the forefront at that time, the big name physicists like Dirac and Feynman and Wheeler, it turns out that a lot of those people at the time were working on very well-funded anti-gravity research. And if you believe in anti-gravity, guess what you probably don't believe is the final word of physics? General relativity theory, right? And so, like, if you're pouring billions of dollars into that, and the guys who were at the forefront of physics were taking this very seriously, and then you've got these guys who will be like, no, we proved that Einstein is right because Mercury or whatever. Like, come on. Like, I call it a middle management ideology. Like, the people at the top definitely don't believe it, but it keeps the middle management in line, you know?
Definitely.
But I was going to ask, what other sort of topics, like, you know, UFOs, ghosts, remote viewing, all sorts of things that I could kind of see as like things that you would come across, that sort of really dogmatic thing. What's been the thing for you that you see is kind of the biggest flare up of that sort of dogma or that kind of instinct to be like, no, we have the information.
Oh boy, there's a lot. There's a lot. One thing that I've been super interested in lately is Michael Levin. If you guys are familiar with him, he's a biologist from Tufts University. And so, to give a little bit of backstory, once upon a time, there was this very big idea within developmental biology called the idea of morphogenetic fields and bioelectricity. And so it was this kind of range of different ideas that were kind of floating around in the early 20th century, mainly in embryology and developmental biology. And again, around the same time period, around like after World War II, you had this thing where what we now call the neo-Darwinian paradigm really came to concretize, because that was around the time that DNA was discovered.
Right.
And so the scientists were like, aha, we discovered what genes are, what heritable traits are, because they're sequences of DNA. So if, you know, organisms have certain traits and somehow we're like programs which are programmed by these DNA sequences. Case closed. We don't need to talk about fields or bioelectricity or any of that woo-woo crap anymore. And lo and behold, you know, a kooky scientist, his name's Michael Levin again, he was really influenced by some of these works pertaining to bioelectricity that had basically been ignored for several decades now. And so, you know, he becomes a, you know, rather prestigious researcher at Tufts University, and he starts actually doing experiments, trying to see if there's something to this. And the things that he had found are, first of all, just absolutely incredible and mind-blowing, but also just devastating to that neo-Darwinian understanding of what life is and how it actually evolves. So I hate to do this because he explains it much better than me, but one particularly striking experiment he's done has been with, he's actually done several on these planarian flatworms. So they're like these little couple-inch long flatworms that have all kinds of interesting properties. They can regenerate, and they reproduce by like basically like tearing themselves in half and all kinds of other cool stuff that biology nerds will geek out over. But anyway, he has done this research pertaining to how traits are actually inherited with these planarian flatworms. And so he did this experiment where he took these flatworms and cut them in half. And basically what he's working with is the idea that somehow electrical gradients between the cells are actually encoding the information that are actually telling these organisms how to regenerate. And so he cuts them in half and then uses this solution of whatever, some kind of chemicals to basically depolarize the electrical potential on the cells on the wound where the cut was. And what happens then is the planarians grow two heads instead of a tail, right? But then when they reproduce, their offspring also have two heads. So that is like a major macro mutation that was achieved without any alteration of DNA whatsoever.
Yeah.
And
wow.
there are lots of other things that he's done that are really interesting. He's created these things he calls xenobots, where he basically took what was it? It was like the dermal cells from frog embryos and just kind of stitched them together, or like put them together so that they just kind of made these little clumps. And so they weren't able to develop into fully formed frogs anymore. But what they did is they basically started forming themselves into these little spherical organisms that behave like organisms. Like they move around and they'll like gobble up cells to grow, and they'll actually reproduce and everything. And so these are complex emergent behaviors that could not have been possibly programmed by DNA, because these things have only ever existed due to human intervention, right? So there's no way natural selection is causing them to do that. This is an emergent behavior that is somehow coming from something more fundamental than that. So anyway, yeah, really exciting stuff.
It feels like we're kind of in the era of those models and everything we've kind of known basically just kind of being blown apart, right? Like even physics with the JWST and everything like that. So like we have all these ideas about how galaxies are formed and all of this stuff, and all it took was the first few images from this new telescope to come through to just completely blow all of that shit out of the water. There's a writer that I really like called Robert Anton Wilson, and he coined these two words that I really like that sort of I hate kind of dumping people in categories and labels and whatever, but I feel like this is kind of two instinctual forces that play within any person's mind, which is basically a neophyte or a neophobe. And so this is someone that is like either very compelled and excited by the idea of new ideas, of new information, of this kind of stuff, or the opposite, that it finds new information, new stuff, new things very scary and like not something to be engaged with. And he kind of makes up that this kind of is the part of the brain which will instinctually make you kind of either, you know, conservative or this sort of politically way inclined, and all these kinds of other rationale behind it. But with the scientism thing, that seems like a really interesting example, because science is the discovery of new things and like embracing them to formulate then like your understanding of stuff, and that's new ideas. But then yet all the people that seem to adopt this sort of dogmatic attitude towards science
are
neophobic in the sense of all of
Exactly.
these new things and new models and new information and stuff. So what do you think about that?
Right. So that's really interesting, because with religion, at least there's an admission of that. It's like, yeah, we're, you know, this is faith, and, you know, it's we're not like doing experiments to prove the Old Testament, or, well, some people are like that, but they kind of fall into the same category we're talking about here. Because what happens, I've noticed with a lot of these people, the neophobes, or whatever we want to call them, the very dogmatic people, is they tend to be very, very religious when they're younger, right? And this is like Susan Blackmore, Michael Shermer, Dan Barker, many of these big name figures, these big name like skeptics and scientism types. And they go through a crisis of faith, usually when they're pretty young, like teens, early 20s, something like that. And they go through this period where they're just really confused. They feel really betrayed by their belief system. And then they find science. And then they're like, oh, well, this is great. This doesn't involve dogma. We can test things. Now I can be right. Now I can actually be correct when I get in the arguments. And you see what's happening here is you've got this shadow material of that need for a sense of religiosity, and they're running away from it. They're repressing it. And what happens, what does Jung tell us? When you try to get away from those contents of the unconscious, you don't actually get away from them. They just go behind the curtain, put on a different hat, and come out the other side and shake your hand, and you're none the wiser if you're drinking the Kool-Aid, you know? And that's exactly what you see with these people. They're like very, very religious. It's just they've completely lost any self-awareness about how religious they are.
It reminds me of the Jungian concept of enantiodromia, or like the return of the opposite. And it's really interesting because Jung talks about now being the sort of the paradigm of like the Antichrist, or the archetype of the Antichrist. And he kind of pinpoints a lot of the pathology of modernity as being a response to the shadow aspects of the Christian paradigm. So now that we're in this hyper materialist, hyper rational, hyper technological age, that sort of representing the archetype of the Antichrist, it's really just kind of an anti-adromia. It's a response to this kind of the failures of the Christian paradigm, and the failures to kind of look at and confront the shadow material of the Christian paradigm. And this extends beyond sort of personal idiosyncrasies. It's like a cultural form at the moment, a macro cultural problem. What do you think about this concept? Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. The thing about the anti-adromia thing is once you start like looking for that process, you start seeing it everywhere. Things like when things lose touch with their kind of guiding logos or whatever you want to call that, they mutate into these like perverted mirror images of themselves. I think you see that everywhere, like the French Revolution, you see it in Marxism, you see it in, I mean, people's lives. I mean, it's everywhere. This just seems to be a very common motif. And it's really fascinating the way it plays out, because when you see those motifs playing out, it has this just really poetic karmic irony to it. And it's like, if you don't see what's going on, it's like, I mean, it really looks like scripted, you know what I mean? Because it has this very narrative logic to it, you know what I mean? But it's a story that's writing itself, but it writes itself in a very logical way, right?
What bugs me is like, how do people not see it though? It's like possession almost, in a way. And I guess secondly, when it comes to attempting to help people see these pitfalls, and see the sort of deeper layers of culture, what are your thoughts about that? Do you think it's worth the efforts to try and wake people up to these sort of unconscious forces? Because in my sort of experience, people tend to reject it when you try to expose the kind of binary code between these different cultural forces that are at play currently.
Yeah, I mean, it really upsets people a lot of the time, because a lot of these things are things that people are anchoring themselves to as a way to feel a sense of groundedness and stability in the world. And upsetting that is very disturbing for people. I mean, they won't admit that that's what's going on most of the time, but the world's a scary place. It's super confusing. It's chaotic. There's all kinds of stuff that we don't know. And this idea that, you know, it doesn't even have to, I mean, it could be a scientism type thing. It could be a political ideology. It could be religious beliefs, anything that gives you a sense of just certainty is going to be something that's going to start to perform that psychological function of allowing you to feel grounded. And then the problem with that then is that if you're not aware that that's what's going on, then you're kind of unconsciously going to begin seeing anything that is challenging that as like a threat, as an evil, as something that needs to be put down and defeated. And so, yeah, I mean, you see that everywhere. And you especially see it when culture forms are going through periods of immense stress, which is definitely something that's happening right now with scientism, right? Because of all these things we're talking about with the JWST and with bioelectricity and yada, yada. The traditional materialistic world paradigm of modern science is changing right now. And the thing that really happens here with people who are really committed to that paradigm is they're going to feel under immense stress. And what happens then is you get what you could call a kind of cultural immune response, or an autoimmune response rather, right? There starts to be this thing where like any kind of organism, whether it's a society or a person or whatever, there's this kind of policing of boundaries between what's inside and good and what's supposed to be outside because it's bad, and then like the idea of like contamination, things that need to be expurgated or attacked. That becomes hyper accentuated during these periods of stress, which is incidentally, this is exactly what you see in the body, like things like alopecia and whatnot. For autoimmune disorders, you use suppressant drugs to treat that. And so I mean, we've all seen this play out with the kind of online leftist spaces. They went through this period of immense stress when the whole Bernie thing fell through, and then it turned into this very like extremist, like ideological witch hunt thing, because that's a cultural autoimmune response. They're attacking anything that looks kind of other, because it's a defense mechanism is essentially what it is, because it's the system is trying to preserve itself. And now we're seeing the exact same thing play out with the IFL science crowd, you know, because they're I think feeling some of the same pressure, whether they realize it or not, because we are going through a transformative period right now. And that means that science itself is going to be less able to serve that psychological function for them. And so they're going to start pointing fingers at each other and being like, oh, you're a pseudoscientist, you're a quack, you can't say that, that's unscientific, you're spreading information, that's anti-science, you're a science denier, you know, and this language is exactly like the language of religious extremism. So
big time. You even saw it, because I'm surprised we haven't mentioned COVID yet, because I think that was a big old paradigm shift for a lot of people.
And a big stress point as
and
well,
a big
right?
stress
Where
point
you
as
had
well.
people reverting into these really kind of, you're a morally incorrect person because you didn't conduct yourself in public in the way that I think the science has said you should. And
yeah, no, there were legitimately people like one of the American talk show hosts, I forget which one, who was advocating that people who didn't get vaccinated should be allowed to die in hospital and should be like denied healthcare. So wow. It was to that level where it was publicly okay to advocate for people to die. And you saw a lot of that shadow material kind of emerge. And especially on the left, obviously, where people tend to identify with good and the beautiful and like suppress all of their evil and ugly qualities. It's almost as if these cultural battlegrounds give them an excuse to bring forth all of that shadow material and sort of all of their projections. And yeah, COVID was definitely one of these pressure points, especially with the sort of believe the science slogan and all of these different things. I think it was definitely a paradigm shift for a lot of people, because it was the first time that a lot of people realized that science isn't just like this epistemological thing, it's so an ideology. And this was one of the times where science and scientific dogma was like really kind of pushed out to the forefront for people to see the way that it behaves like an ideology. I wonder what you think about that. What were your thoughts on the COVID climate?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a watershed moment, because I think a lot of people who are kind of within the educated kind of liberal classes, you know, people who have, you know, either gone to college or at least, you know, consume popular science, you know, people who generally have a pretty positive outlook on scientists in general and look up to these ideas, really got swept up into that. But it was very divisive then, because then you've got like the other 80% of the population who just kind of sees science as this thing that makes toasters and televisions or whatever. And there was a lot more skepticism coming from them. So it created this massive divide where there was this seeking of acceptable targets that was going on, which you already mentioned. That was definitely a big part of it. But I think the cracks really began to form, because the thing is that kind of scientismic culture is necessarily one that can't be insulated, right? Like, you know, inevitably you're going to bump into other people who do not necessarily believe that the commonly accepted narrative about that was entirely truthful. And then lo and behold, you're going to actually have to defend your beliefs against somebody who might know things that you don't know. And so it creates this tumultuousness, which I do think is a good thing ultimately, because that has to land somewhere, and it's definitely not going to land on a universal bowing down to the cult of science, I don't believe. But yeah, it's crazy, because I feel like we're going to be living in the fallout of that for the rest of our lives easily.
Oh yeah.
I think science is such a such an obscure thing to sort of try to debate any sort of morals or have that kind of stance on as well, right? Especially when it was something as emerging as COVID, because it was constantly changing, and also it felt like in the kind of current era that we're in, that all information is so fucking polarized and geared towards making you either feel happy in your camp or do you know what I mean? Like that you can't really like fully like trust science in that similar way. It's like it's just all information in some regard, right? And like I think it's sort of a lot of people kind of have that feeling. And I think even when you're having like conversations with people and they start to name off like this person, it's like you're fucking Jeff down the pub. You don't fucking know anything more than anybody else that is like in this situation or whatever. But people will speak with such conviction about it.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's kind of like it comes around to that sort of dogma approach to everything as well, right? Like there's another Robert Anton Wilson quote I'll drop on this episode. When dogma enters the brain, intelligent activity ceases to happen.
Which is very true. Very, very true.
And another one as well is the map is not the territory and the menu is not the meal, right? And so I think a lot of people have these ideas about stuff, but then it doesn't really come into congruency with reality and how they live their lives and all of these other things, right? And so it causes all the skepticism and everything else. I think it's a really shit time for science, like honest science and like good stuff. But you also like, what is anything funded by now? It makes everything so fucking questionable. Like, and I think there was a period of time before the internet where you could have all of these kind of things be obscured and you would take people's word on whatever. Like science was done to prove that smoking cigarettes was good for you. Right? Like that was done for decades. It was advised by doctors to smoke to cure asthma. Like it's it's fucking insane. So I just I have that in my mind, especially post COVID these days.
But even just speaking of science is sort of an epistemological exercise. It's like the constant discovery and the constant sort of unfolding of reality and of the processes of reality. So the idea of becoming dogmatic about that seems totally counterintuitive.
It's being dogmatic about a necessarily moving target, which is
exactly. And that's kind of what perplexes me, is that like it seems to go over the sort of I fucking love science people's heads totally, because they're not really thinking about things philosophically. They're not thinking about things, and a lot of them actually look down on philosophy, and they think that those of us who are interested in philosophy are like retarded and not worth listening to. But I think that if they did think about things a little bit more philosophically, they could avoid these pitfalls. And I also think it's really sad that like thinking philosophically is only really like okay online. It's not something that's necessarily encouraged outside of the hallowed halls of academia or in like society as a whole. So people are more likely to go online in order to talk about philosophy or explore philosophy. But there's also a ton of the online realm is also incredibly atomizing, and there are all these sorts of insular rabbit holes, and it's not like the best place for real philosophical excavation. So there's that as a problem. But yeah, I do think that if there was more philosophy alongside science, that there'd be a lot less of a sort of, it would be a lot less easy for people to fall into these pitfalls. I wonder what you think about that. Do you think that their lack of philosophical knowledge and curiosity contributes to some of these problems?
Yeah, again, and I mean, if you just look at quotes by scientists about philosophy, like scientists were philosophers. It was a branch of philosophy. This was just commonly accepted as how it works until about the 1950s. Again, that's really the breaking point after World War II, I think. But I mean, if you look back at statements by people like Max Planck or even Einstein, I mean, Einstein, his whole thing was really just kind of a mathematical, scientific elaboration of ideas that he picked up from Immanuel Kant and Spinoza. Right. So, I mean, it's always been that way.
Yeah.
And,
absolutely.
One criticism that was leveled at me by, the lovely people at the Scientism club was that I care about stories and not science, which is really funny, because when you start looking at the history of science, that's when you start to realize just how narrative science really is. So, I mean, just to take the most pedestrian example of this, we look back on the early 17th century and we're like, yeah, that's when we discovered that the earth revolves around the sun, and Ptolemy was wrong, and something about excuse me, something about Galileo's little telescope figured that out, and blah blah blah. And then, you know, but nobody really knows what happens. When you actually look back at what happened is this: Copernicus proposed the idea of a geocentric cosmology because he didn't like the epicycles that were in the Ptolemaic cosmology. You needed to have this thing where there were like these extra little circles so that the planets would line up. But the thing is, that model worked with the epicycles, and it actually made accurate predictions. And the Copernican model just didn't. It was wrong, but people liked it anyway because of really just metaphysical ideas. The idea that the sun is bigger than the earth, and therefore, you know, it produces the light. It seems like it should be the thing in the middle, right? And it wasn't until much, much later when Kepler came up with the idea of elliptical orbits that really kind of allowed the Copernican model to be brought back into accordance with observation. Now, the reason why you couldn't have elliptical orbits in the Ptolemaic system, in the ancient Greek world, was because the heavens were supposed to be perfect, and ellipses are not perfect. So if things aren't circular, you just need to add more little circles, and then everything still ends up being perfect, right? So, but what happened here is that this was in the post-Cartesian world. Descartes had done his, you know, I think, therefore I am, and really initiated this big break between the classical period of philosophy and the modernist period of philosophy. And people were a lot more comfortable with ideas that didn't necessarily accord with that Platonic cosmology anymore. And so the way that Galileo fits into this, he did not prove that the earth moves around the sun. What he did is he took his telescope and showed that the splotches on the moon are craters. It's not perfect. He showed that Jupiter has moons. It's not just the earth that has one. And so it reinforced this idea that the heavenly realm was just an extension of the natural world. That was a radically new idea at the time, and it was a metaphysical idea, right? And so what happened there, that was such a breakthrough moment, because the purview, the scope of natural philosophy expanded from the bounds of the firmament to the universe as a whole. Okay, so that's a big movement that happened right there. But nobody proved anything. There was no experiment that decided the heliocentric model in favor of the geocentric one. In fact, if we wanted to, we could use a geocentric model right now, and it would perfectly accord with everything, because space is relative. There is no absolute space. There is no real center of the solar system. We could just, in our, you know, a model is an act of imagination, right? So in our heliocentric acts of imagination, we're pretending that the sun is holding still and everything's moving around that. But we could also just hold the earth still, and, you know, you get the other planets moving in these weird little loopity loops. That's not necessarily less correct. You guys have probably seen this GIF that's been floating around a bunch lately, and it's like the sun and it's moving, and then you've got this kind of like spiral thing with the planet following it. You've seen that? Yeah. And that's neat. But the way it's being posed to people is like, oh, this is what the solar system's really like. But again, movement implies the idea that something is being held still relative to that. So within that model, what's holding still? The
very core of the galaxy or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Well, but either way, it's the same thing. It's arbitrary to treat the galactic core as the center. We just think, oh, it's a black hole, so it's like even bigger than the sun, so it's more privileged. But again, that's a metaphysical decision. There's no way of deciding that with a telescope, right? So anyway, point being, science is always a story. It always has been. So
definitely. I guess I'm more familiar with like the sort of psychological domain. And yeah, my fascination with Jung mainly stems from the fact that he started out as like a sort of material scientist, and he was sort of, you know, best pals with Freud and was attempting to legitimize psychoanalysis as a true science. And I mean, part of the reason that Freud split with Jung in the first place is because he didn't like the fact that all of Jung's weird esoteric shit may, you know, sully the reputation of psychology as a hard science. But even within Jung's body of work, he doesn't he doesn't fully reject the scientific paradigm, but he also leaves room for the psycho-spiritual, for the transpersonal in that sense. It's sort of a reconciliation of these two conflicting paradigms, but he reconciles them incredibly seamlessly. I'm currently working on a second video about his UFO essay. And one of the things that he talks about in that is the fact that he is accused of, he's accused by scientists of making this physical phenomenon purely psychological, but then he's also accused by theologians of psychoanalyzing the spiritual. So he can't win. He's kind of like called a piece of shit by everybody, and in that sense he kind of becomes ghettoized. But I like this notion of sort of as above so below. I like the idea of the reconciliation of the opposites. One of the really interesting things that he talks about is the gulf between faith and knowledge being closed in this age that we're in at the moment, and how those two things are going to sort of become one eventually. And I kind of think that this is the growing pains of that process. And I think part of the reason he was also so fascinated with UFOs is because he felt like this phenomenon would act as sort of a forcing function for the human psyche to, you know, unlock elements of its depths that have been suppressed by the sort of secular scientific paradigm that we currently inhabit. I wonder what you think of this notion of sort of a reconciliation between a material worldview and a spiritual worldview. Do you think it's possible, or do you think that those two things are diametrically opposed?
I think it's absolutely necessary, and it's really the end goal that's pulling all of these transformations forward.
I agree, big time.
The Platonic perspective of the world was one in which the material world was this kind of temporal, fleeting kind of thing. It was, you know, shadows on the cave wall. We all know that metaphor. And then the transcendental world was eternal. And what's happened over time is you can think of it like this idea of becoming, of evolution. It starts with just like ideas about things in nature, like plants and animals with Aristotle and whatnot, and it slowly expands, right? And again, that's what we saw with that geocentric to heliocentric transition, this expansion of the idea that the world is actually dynamic and evolutionary. But within the currently prevailing scientific paradigm, that division has actually been maintained this entire time, because the idea of the eternal, unchanging, law-giving God, the clock maker of the clockwork universe, is still there. They just don't call it God anymore. They call it the laws of physics, but it's doing the exact same thing. It's performing this exact same function as the idea of an unchanging transcendental. So it's still clinging to these last vestiges of Platonism. I don't want to make it out like I have a problem with Platonism. I think that there's no choice but to think within Plato to some extent, within really just philosophy in general, because Plato is just kind of a manifestation of this even deeper heritage that we're all indebted to. But nonetheless, this aspect of it is really important here, because this idea of the world as something evolutionary is really what's at play here, I think, and what's happening, I believe, with cosmology and with biology and with Carl Jung and his analysis of like the archetypes and the collective unconscious. All of these things would have been regarded as these celestial, eternal things previously, but now, like within all of those different purviews, we're starting to see these things as kind of transcendental. Still, they're still not just like physical objects that you can put in a box. They're still kind of archetypal or morphological in some sense, but they're dynamic. They're themselves kind of mutating over time. And science has yet to really catch up to that, I believe. There was this one of the OGs of science, this guy named Johann von Goethe, who was a like late 18th, early 19th century German super intellectual, you know, one of those guys like Hegel and Schelling and all that. And he did all of this work on like botany and geology. And the stuff with botany is so incredible because it's like the most humble thing you can imagine. He's literally just like looking at a flower and he's like, how does this actually work? And he develops a whole completely different idea of science out of that, which he contrasts with Newton. And it is like, I want to use the word holism, but I think that word gets used a little bit too much. But it's he's working with this idea that nature is driven by this kind of, you could call it archetypal, but this kind of underlying blueprint, which nature is just kind of exploring as it goes. And so he develops this idea of what he calls the or phenomenon. So the or as in like primordial, and then phenomena, which is kind of like the idea of an archetype, right? And he's looking at all these different like plants and animals and whatnot in that way. And he develops a theory of color out of it, where he looks at just like the rainbow. And he's like, how can we understand this in terms of the actual organization of human experience of light, right? So this is very different than Newton. Newton is looking at this and he's trying to do this in a way that really involves mathematical metaphors. So he starts talking about like wavelength and particles, which are still metaphors that we work with today. But then if you look at the actual science, you know, where are the waves? Where are the particles? Goethe said that those are just metaphors we're using. And when we mistake the map for the territory here, we're really making a big mistake, because everything has to refer back to experience. And within that kind of Newtonian way of looking at color, for example, the idea is like, okay, there's light, and it has these things called wavelengths, and then somehow like color is just how we organize those different properties. So this is, you see this in John Locke, his idea of primary qualities and secondary qualities. So there's like the world in itself, and then there's the way that our minds just kind of like stamp phenomenological properties onto it, right? Like, so maybe my mind is using the red stamp for this wavelength, but your mind is using it differently. Goethe's like, no. Look, there's something archetypal going on here that actually connects human beings to the world. We are continuous with the world. We're not just this little pinprick of consciousness with this little stamp machine that's putting subjective properties on our sensory inputs. We are the world.
Yeah.
And so anyway, point being is he develops this very radically different way of understanding things, which is very congruent with Jung, his ideas, very congruent with these ideas of like bioelectricity and morphogenetic fields, which I've talked quite a bit about. And I think it really points to the synthesis, the union of opposites here, because then you're taking that kind of those Platonic ideas of transcendental forms and these ideas of scientific naturalism, and you're kind of merging them together. So
definitely. Jung even talks about in the UFO essay how the unconscious exists irrespective of if consciousness is there to observe it, which is sort of similar to what you're talking about, these sorts of primordial processes sort of already being there regardless of whether our conscious minds are there to kind of observe it, which was a radical idea for him in terms of his feats in psychology, in the same way that it's a radical idea in the realm of science as well.
So do you see sort of this the way that people have this dogmatic attachment to science, that this is something that's sort of grown and blossomed over the sort of decades, that this is actually something that just looks a bit different now in this time period but was something else in 1800s, and that actually we are like kind of what you said, basically, it's all part of the story, and these are the growing pains and the uncomfortable part, and showing that shadow and coming into contact with that, and we're just digging our heels in further, or there is some kind of event or something or whatever to sort of make people shackle that a little bit more and be open to the world and all the weirdness that it has.
So you definitely see a kind of arc here over time, I think, because if you go back to like the kind of the early Enlightenment period, you don't really see what I would describe as scientism, because at the time science was still like an extension of theology. Yeah. I mean, there was no apology about that. It was, I mean, Newton did not see like his esoteric pursuits and his physics as two different things. Like for him, it was all just naturalism, which was trying to understand the mind of God. That was it.
Yeah.
You know, and over the 19th century, that's when the Industrial Revolution happens, and this idea of connecting science to these ideas of technological power start to really form, and economic power as well. Of course, those are very deeply connected. But even then, the people who are doing the science are not like this weird cult of like mRNA vaccine peddling psychopaths. They're like weird, eccentric, rich people who are like intellectual, but intellectual in a different sense than we're familiar with today. Like today, intellectual means like you went to like grad school and got a PhD or something. Like being an intellectual in the 19th century meant that like you were learning to read Greek and Latin when you were like 8 years old. You know what I mean? So these guys were like a whole different caliber than us, unfortunately. I would love to be able to speak Greek and Latin, but
same here. I'm learning a little through you reading Jung, though, so I think that I'll have to be happy with.
But anyway, these guys were like very entrenched within the Western philosophical tradition, and there was no making excuses for that. You know what I mean? That was just like how it was. And it's not until later on that there actually one really big event that happened during the early 20th century were these big debates between this French philosopher named Henri Bergson and Einstein that happened, right? And so Bergson, he's a really interesting character. He's got this kind of process philosophical thing that I usually connect to these different people like Goethe and Whitehead and whatnot. So anyway, I'm a fan, but he had some big problems with Einstein because he believed that Einstein, like I mentioned earlier, Einstein's really just taking this very Kantian idea of like space and time and like formalizing it into a mathematically rigorous system of physics. And Bergson's like, this doesn't work because what this is doing is it's taking human experience, which is what we're supposed to be starting from in the whole project of doing science and doing naturalism, and you're sawing off the branch you're sitting on, because time is so absolutely fundamental to our experience of the world. And what Einstein's system really does is it takes time and it makes it into a fourth spatial dimension. So you end up with this kind of block time where, like, objectively speaking, time isn't like really real. It's only real with regards to like particular frames of reference. Which means that, like, from a God's eye perspective, like it's like the whole universe is just all happening at once. This is part of the reason why Einstein had such a problem with quantum mechanics, because Einstein really did believe in like a fully determinate universe that was just set in stone, start to finish from the beginning. You can't really have that if you have this kind of like quantum indeterminacy thing going on. But anyway,
Einstein believed that there was a determinate universe, because that is very much like
Nietzschean.
That's like getting rid of free will and all sorts of things. In
like
that
the eternal recurrence kind of idea.
Einstein was a Spinozist, so he believed that God and nature were essentially synonymous, or at the very least that nature was kind of an outgrowth of God at the very least, and that this idea of like perfect harmony was at work in the universe. And again, there are different ways that you can kind of construe that idea of like a perfect celestial harmony. Again, it's a very different thing for somebody like Goethe. or even for Plato. But within Einstein's worldview, that means that everything has its place and it is just what it is. And yes, there is no free will within Einstein's cosmology. He believed, I'm gonna butcher this quote just a little bit, but one thing famously that he said was that our experience of existing through time is a stubbornly persistent illusion. So he believed that we only really experience time because of the contingency of our particular subjectivity. If you could back up out of that and see the world from a God's eye point of view, there really is no time. Everything's kind of happening at once, and you see that expressed within general relativity because, again, if within general relativity, because everything is relative to particular frames of reference. If you're looking at the world from a kind of non-frame of reference, then everything is kind of happening at once. But anyway, to go back to Bergson, Bergson's got a big problem with this, not because of any quantum woo-woo or anything like that, but because he's saying, look, if you do this, then you're relegating as illusory one of the fundamental aspects of human experience, which is one of our starting point for doing this whole science thing to begin with. Mm-hmm. And Bergson, he's got his own idea of what time is as well, which I'm not going to get into, but this was a big deal in this historical trajectory, because what happened here is it was this huge debate, and like Einstein was supposed to get a Nobel Prize, but there was a bunch of controversy because of Bergson, and that ended up not happening. And it just ended up being this thing where Bergson was extremely popular at the beginning of this whole debacle. And by the end of it, because so many people sided with Einstein, he ended up just kind of being disgraced. And now you barely even hear about Bergson anymore anywhere, because the commonly accepted narrative, at least, is that Einstein was just right and Bergson was just wrong. And if Bergson's wrong about time, and time is so central to his philosophy, then why bother with his philosophy? So anyway, but that's really important here in this whole trajectory, because that's one of those moments where you started to have that rupture where science starts to think of itself as something different from philosophy.
So for the last 10 minutes, since we're on Mystic in the Machine and technology is one of our primary talking points, what do you think of this notion that science, sort of that the epistemological proof for science is technology? In that sense, that seems to be an assumption that is made by many sort of scientific dogmatists, and especially in terms of their view of society and the future. A lot of them tend not to think too much about the implications that technology has on our culture, on our psyche. They're just sort of utopian in their notions about what technology can do to improve the human condition, despite any of the consequences of it, because they literally view technology as the proof of their paradigm, their dogmatic paradigm. I wonder what you think of this idea. And I'm like I call myself a Butlerian jihadist.
Yeah.
But I wonder what you think of this idea.
Oh, there's a lot to be said about that. I'm gonna have to do a part 2 to that science video. That's gonna happen. Oh, there's so many things. Well, first of all, the thing is that like 99.99 blah 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 % of the universe is not made out of machines, but we've created this world in which we're surrounded by machines, and when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So that's a big part of it phenomenologically, because we start to see even living things as just squishy machines with blood flowing through their veins. And I think there's a very big distinction here to be made kind of ontologically, right? Like the cells in your kidney know that they're doing kidney things for a human being. Like there's an interconnectedness of whole and parts that's going on here, where the whole system has a kind of agency and a kind of self-organizing power to it. And like you just don't see this in machines. If you smash your phone, it's not going to put itself back together. Living bodies do that, right? Even like an amoeba. We've got all this fancy technology we look at. We're like, oh yeah, man, we got satellites and space shuttles. nothing humanity has ever created is even within the ballpark of what an amoeba can do. Okay, but it's made out of matter, and we're working with matter, right? So you'd think, with all this science, we would have made, at least some progress in being able to replicate what life is able to do, but we don't, and we don't because the organizational principles at work, I believe, are just completely different. But there's another aspect of this I want to bring up, and it's the epistemological function, not just as kind of an apologetics, not just where you're saying, oh, this is true because it makes nonstick frying pans work, but also when you're actually using using technology as a methodological instrument, right? And so what's happening a lot now with the kind of like big money science, you got these particle colliders and satellites and gravitational wave detectors and God knows what else. What happens is you've got these machines that are essentially filtering just obscene amounts of data, just enormous amounts of stuff. And they have to filter that data, and they're filtering that data on the basis of the theoretical presumptions that are being baked into the cake, that are being actually built into these machines that tell them what to look for. And so just to give a stupid example, like if I'm trying to prove my like Eiffel Tower shaped cloud theorem, and I build a machine that's designed to look at billions of photos of clouds and give me the Eiffel Tower shaped ones, it's going to prove the theorem because it's going to find some that fit that bill. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But you see this is in everything, and people don't realize it because they don't realize just how much filtering is going on. And it does create these epistemological loops. So one big famous thing that we've seen recently is that photo of a black hole, right? And you get that little like orange donut looking thing. It turns out that is so doctored, and it's doctored in ways that are entirely based on the presumption that that was a photo of a black hole, that it's kind of like what's a good example here? Like if you're given a bunch of data and you're asked to carve it out in the shape of something you're looking for already, and then you present that as evidence of the thing. Right, like that's an epistemological problem. It's a loop, and those are everywhere now. So that's a whole thing that we could get into. But yeah, that's another way in which technology is really, really shaping and distorting, I would say, our views of things.
Well, I think the space images stuff has come under a bit of scrutiny more recently than ever. I think there's been a number of cases that I've seen online where it's been proven that clouds have been copied and pasted over regions of satellite imagery, and a lot of the imagery they've taken from Mars has been oranged to make it look orange, to make it not look like it's like Earth, to make it look
like the red planet.
Yeah, to make it look like The Martian, dude, to make it look like the fucking film. And that only recently they've sort of started to de-orange Mars. And how have they done that? Is that like camera filters, or what's going on with that? Why all of a sudden it kind of looks like a normal place? But for decades it's been like the red planet, and every image we get from there it's fucking orange. Like
maybe Mars doesn't exist.
I'm not saying that Mars doesn't exist. I'm just, but it is a thing of just like, well, you trust if you see an image come up from NASA on your social media or whatever, that this is the latest finding. This is the picture, the best picture we have of a black hole. This is the latest images we've had from Mars. This is whatever. You take that on a certain amount of faith that they are fucking not good images, right? As soon as a big institution like that starts to do stuff like that, it certainly throws so many fucking questions up in the air, right?
And I remember the good old days when somebody would be like, man, the moon is a satellite, the government put it there, and you'd be like, wow, that person's crazy. And now today someone says it and you're just like,
maybe.
Is it? Is it?
There's a lot of funky shit about the moon that I would love science to really come to the bottom of.
Don't get me started on the moon and the tiny men that live inside of it.
Oh dear. Oh, who knows?
But like, I guess our final question for you is, how do you well, I guess I'll pose it to all of us. How do you recommend people stay grounded in this time of uncertainty and ontological models being challenged and mass hysteria? What is your advice for remaining grounded in this paradigm shift that we're experiencing on the collective?
Well, I guess the real answer to that is that, you know, our grounding should really never be about theories to begin with. Like, because again, you're trying to hold a moving target still. It's just never going to work. Grounding, I think, it's much more existential, shall we say. It's much more, or it should have more to do, I think, with our idea of like the worthwhileness of life and what that really means in terms of like what we're doing here and why that matters. And again, the details of that can be fuzzy sometimes. I think this is something that's kind of better off being fuzzy, though. Like this, you know, it's a kind of gut instinct that I think we feel that we can lose sight of so easily, that just existing is kind of serving some kind of purpose. You know, different people, especially religious people, will have specific ideas about what exactly that means. And I don't even necessarily think that they're wrong, but I think that just that intuitive feeling itself has this immense value that can't be overstated. And we really mess up when we try to replace that with something else. So
yes, big time. I was going to say the same thing about the function of intuition and how much modern culture is attempting to sever us away from it. I mean, I brought up COVID last, and I think that's like a visceral example of a cultural moment where people were sort of forcibly divorced from that intuitive feeling and shamed for it. Politically, you see this phenomenon in the world of science, in the world of philosophy. You see this phenomenon where people are constantly sort of being ripped away from their intuition, even though it's the primary tool that we have to navigate anything. So I guess my advice would just be to like really hone into that and take it more seriously than ever, because you're going to need it. Like, you're going to need it in this coming period for sure. How about you, Jake? Do you have any more Robert Anton Wilson quotes for us?
I have no Robert Anton Wilson quotes that serve as guidance for the moving. Oh, but there probably is, but I can't think of them right now off the top of my head. But I guess for me, I think the best way I've seen navigating everything at the moment is with a giant lump of salt and an open heart. Is the best way I can describe it. It's like all the information you take, big fucking pinch of salt every time, really kind of weigh it up against other stuff that you've heard, other things that you've read, everything else. Like, question everything, I guess, is sort of that thing. But then also have a genuinely open heart to the possibilities of reality and information and everything in your life, because it will probably surprise you.
I definitely like the fact that you're calling towards the heart. I think that's definitely another mechanism that we're being severed from, even though it's probably the best one for processing anything, really. It's such a powerful element of the human soul. But yeah, anything else to add before we close?
I think that's too strong a note to end on anything else. So yeah, let's cap it up with that. Awesome. Yeah, we're talking to you guys. This is great. We should totally
amazing. Plug yourself before you go. Let people know where they can find you.
Oh, right. Yeah. Formscapes on YouTube. We've also got a website now, formscapes.org. I'm going to start doing classes, actually, where I'm going to be teaching, going through some of these books I talk about chapter by chapter, and just teaching it like a regular class. So if you want to do that, come check it out. We're starting that next month. And yeah, that'll do it, I suppose.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, and we could go for hours with you, and I'm sure we'll have you on again, definitely.
Oh, absolutely.
If you would like to come back on.
I'm here for it. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you guys in the audience too, and we shall catch you later. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.